Totalitarian, Part 5. 47. Trigger. Harper stood on the steps of Trafalgar Square in front of maybe 10,000 people, who wondered what had happened to their saviour Lacole. They stood beneath a clear blue sky, and the crowd cheered like a festival. Lacole, Lacole, Lacole was the chant, adding pressure to Harper, who felt the burden of his news grow to dangerous proportions. He looked to his right and saw Chirac, thinking how even a giant frame like him couldn't help him now. The crowd's energy could be felt, seen in the air as hands waved. Iram stood to Harper's left. They didn't want him far out of their sight. He looked like a shadow of himself, slouching with his head hung low, looking like a bad word could send him into a mental breakdown. Harper refocused on the crowd, noticing some individual cries from people at the front. "Where is she? Bring us Lacole!" he could hear. He took a deep breath and prepared to devastate them. "People!" shouted Harper. The crowd fell silent. "I bring you bad news," said Harper, wincing. He tried to speak again, but couldn't. He was reminded of the moment Lacole spoke about the dossier, how she froze then. He remembered telling her to be strong. The crowd's silence hung like a heart, and Harper felt like the unfortunate knife about to cut through. He took a deep breath and delivered the message. "Lacole is dead," said Harper solemnly. Something further than silence took the crowd. He could almost see its pulse. Then there was a roar of boos and jeers from a mass of bodies. Anger and cries were lost in confusion and desperation. Harper gave the people a minute, as all noises of humanity was exposed, trying to digest the shock in their own ways. Harper bowed his head, feeling sorry for them, sharing their pain. He then raised his head high and felt it was time to show them a future. "People, please, listen." Harper's voice struggled on the crowd, still emotionally torn, not knowing where to direct their feelings. "What happened?" shouted a man at the front. Again the crowd fell silent. Harper prepared to break their heart for a second time. "She was murdered," said Harper, laying it bare in front of them. It was a universal noise of misery, with the odd cry. Harper tried to shout, but the crowd just got louder. As anger began to fill the air, the crowd's movement became erratic. As Harper feared a riot could break out, the sound of gunshots rang through the air. Chirac poured bullets into the air, making the crowd fall silent. "Listen to him," shouted Chirac. "Tell them the truth." Harper swallowed hard. "She was murdered," said Harper, looking at Iram. His eyes blinked at the ground. "Murdered by the EE," said Harper with gritted teeth. Chirac lowered his head in disappointment. Harper's lie lifted Iram, but he didn't feel happy. He didn't dare feel that emotion, just thankful his life had been spared. "She was shot while she slept," said Harper. An uneasy silence took hold of the crowd. Harper knew this was the moment to restore their belief. "But look at what she achieved," continued Harper. "I look around and I see hope. Do not let this be the day we turned our back on our dream. Let not fear and misery creep back into our lives. Let this be the day Lacole lived. The day a woman so strong, even in death she fought on, fighting within us." Harper could hear the crowd murmur. He could feel their eyes and hearts grow. "I say let today be the day of sorrow, and tomorrow be the day of change. Show me what this woman meant." Harper watched young and old, men and women nod. He continued. "Tomorrow, outside Westminster, we stand beside one another and we fight the evil that has plagued us. Let her not die in vain. Lacole shall still bring freedom to this nation," shouted Harper. The crowd roared and Harper lifted a clenched fist. "Tomorrow, we meet upon the bridge outside Westminster and we fight for our freedom." Harper shouted, "Spread the word! Spread the word!" Chirac fired his gun into the sky, and Harper put his arm around him. "Gather as many people as possible, as many guns, as many weapons. Tomorrow we show them no mercy." Chirac gave a nod and smiled. and prepared mentally to save a nation and its people, along with the thousands who cheered. 48. Message. Harper left the rally and made his way back to headquarters, trying to capture the momentum he had created. He walked into Cowell's computer room. The silence made him feel very alone. The room looked bigger and felt colder, almost suffocating as he took off his jacket and moved to the radio. He sat down and switched on the green light. He pulled the microphone in close and touched his lips, then spoke. "Tomorrow, we meet on Westminster Bridge, upon the side of the Eye. We meet at 10 a.m. Fight for your freedom, for this simple reason. This nation has been plunged into dark depths, but a nation we remain. We aren't defined by our history or wealth. We are defined by our beliefs. Much good may have been forgotten, but we haven't disappeared. It's time to redefine this nation, to rediscover our humanity. Tomorrow, when you look into the gates of hell, remember the values this country was built upon, and use them values against that evil. We'll rid ourselves of this plague. Then, we will rebuild a nation." Harper put down the microphone and closed his eyes, resting his head on the old wooden desk. He fell asleep, as though his subconscious knew his body needed rest. "49. Destiny. The next morning a thin fog hovered on the Thames. For many, this was the centre of the world. Now it was the future for thousands that waited to cross the bridge and discover their destiny. A crowd had gathered like Harper had asked. Together, packed tightly, they marched past the London Eye in near silence. Harper led from the front, in army camo trousers tucked tightly into big black leather boots. He wore a black vest, and over his shoulder was ammunition belt for his rifle. The men behind him marched on rage. Harper looked back and estimated maybe 2,000 men. The front was made up of ex-soldiers and police. Some even wore bulletproof vests, and a few had rifles. Rumours were the occasional man had even a grenade. Behind them was a second wave, made up of ex-bouncers and healthy young angry men. They had passion, and most carried knives. Behind them was a third wave, men with unstable anger needing to prove who they were. Their weapon of choice was cricket bats and baseball bats. The crowd marched over the Thames towards Westminster. The palace looked beautiful, as it always did, like it was glowing gold in the sun. The huge clock tower felt pointless in a world where time felt like it had stopped, just a never-changing dread. But the men marched hell-bent on changing that. Harper looked across the bridge and saw the EE was ready, lined up at the far end of the bridge in black, looking like the disease they were. They had infected Westminster. Harper looked back at his own men in all colours. To him, they were a rainbow coming to cure a country. In front of Harper, another crowd of men approached, in the same formation with the same intention. The two crowds of men and some boys met, ready to fight for their freedom. They halted just before the bridge and waited for Harper's word. Harper raised an arm, and a few thousand men fell quiet as he stepped out and prepared to address them. He spoke loud, and his voice carried well on the thin air. Lacole didn't just want freedom. Her name literally meant it. The truth is, actions speak louder than words, and that's why we're here. Yesterday, we lost someone great, but she will not die, not in vain. Whatever they may do, we do not stop. It's for our freedom, shouted Harper. The crowd cheered from end to end, and it gave Harper goosebumps as he swallowed. He turned and stepped onto the bridge. The EE waited in regiment, perfect precision. Harper's steps were bold, and Chirac walked strong by his side. Harper grew with confidence, estimating there was no more than 300 EE guards who waited for them. He smiled at their mistake, noticing a lone EE member walking toward them. Harper turned and tried to bring his men to a halt. Stop! Shouted Chirac. The men came to a sluggish halt that made Harper cringe. He ignored it and walked towards the EE guard, leaving Chirac to control the men. The walk seemed long and he felt uneasy. The closer he got, the more he was reminded of what he once was. The EE guard was no ordinary soldier. He was older and looked experienced in the field of war. Not battle experience, but the experience of sending men to their deaths from behind a desk. He was more of an officer. His face was long, and he had white short hair with thin glasses. He stopped and took off his spectacles, putting them into his pocket, and began to talk without introduction. "You understand that if this demonstration continues, we will have no option but to fire upon you," he said patronizingly, barely looking at Harper in the eye. Harper glared at him and held his rifle tightly. "This is no demonstration. If you are not careful, this is a war. Lay down your weapons, or we will attack. We will storm the gates and force the Prime Minister to resign. We will liberate this nation," said Harper, taking a step forward. The EE officer smiled, then laughed. "With what? You're barbarians? You're an embarrassment. Do you understand we're creating an empire? And do you think some hoodies and tracky suit bottoms with an attitude can prevent our plans? Look at them," said the EE officer. Harper did nothing but stare. "Fair enough, have it your way," he said, turning away, heading back towards the darkness of the EE. He then paused and looked back. "Harry Harper, isn't it? Tell me, how far did you ever get with Lacole? Let me tell you something. I once had her in chains, and I got myself a good handful. You know what I mean?" said the officer, laughing, continuing his walk to his regiment. Harper fought hard not to put a bullet in the back of his head. He breathed in deeply and headed back towards the crowd. Chirac came up the bridge. "What did he say?" said Chirac. "If we go near them, they'll shoot," said Harper, looking at his men. All of a sudden they looked old and tired. The cheers from the youth came at the back, and Harper realized his problem. His experience lacked energy and drive. They were trying their best to hide it, but as he looked deeply into their souls, he could see an unwillingness to fight. And the men at the back weren't really men. They were angry boys that lacked discipline. Both were no match for a killing machine that would destroy anything in its way. Harper had numbers, but he knew that didn't win wars. He questioned what he was doing. He didn't want to be responsible for the deaths of so many. Perhaps Lacole was right. Perhaps there was another way. Chirac noticed Harper's wondering eyes, and he could see bad thoughts creeping into his mind. "We didn't come here to negotiate. We came to take back our country," said Chirac, trying to put passion back into Harper. "We didn't come to die either. This was a bad idea," said Harper, shaking his head. Don't you dare turn your back on me now," said Chirac. The energy of the crowd was building as Harper's diminished. The odd man spilled forward from the pressure, the men at the back. The shouts had become chants, and the bats and the clubs of the mob could be seen waving in the air. "They need to calm down," shouted Harper, fearing it was too late. The crowd seemed to be at boiling point. The men at the front tried hard to contain them, but then it happened. A tirade of men smashed through their ranks, running with bats and knives, screaming to one another, gathering their energy and confidence. Their faces showed tormented souls, transfixed on an enemy. Harper looked in horror as hundreds of young men ran past him. "No, wait!" shouted Harper. He watched the EE raise their guns as hundreds of men in hoods, high on the idea of freedom, ran towards the enemy, getting closer and closer. Then 10 feet away, all hell opened up. The EE opened fire. Hundreds of dreams and aspirations were ripped apart, along with skin and bone. A mist of blood began to rise as rapid fire sent body after body onto the concrete floor. Blood spilled, and a covering of death turned the bridge red. The rapid gunfire then came to a halt. It was then screams were heard. Youths lay dying, looking up at the emotionless faces of the EE with their last breaths, realizing the real depths of evil. Few survivors ran back towards the crowd that also turned and run. Harper's dream had been destroyed by bullets. Then, something happened that Harper didn't even expect. The EE raised their guns again. Harper froze and whispered 3 words. God, no, please. The EE opened fire again. Bullets rained upon the mass of people. While shooting, they marched forward, killing the innocent, who surrendered, but still, their bullets didn't stop. Harper watched the revolution disappear as hundreds of men fell to the ground. They climbed upon each other, scraping and clawing at friends to escape the bullets. A revolution had turned into genocide. "What have I done?" said Harper, alone in the centre of the bridge as bullets flew past him. Harper sat down on the floor and embraced death. The sound of gunfire seemed to last a lifetime, as he waited for one bullet to end it all. He had become a prisoner within himself again. Nothing seemed real as he waited to die. "50. Chance." "Why am I not dead?" was Harper's first thought. He hadn't died, and he didn't know why. He looked down at the ground and couldn't move, held by the clutches of death that he had taken the hand of, waiting to be taken to hell. Alone he waited for the end. Then a noise tore into his unreality. There was a rumble of thunder behind him. His senses switched on, feeling the ground below him and the breeze. Then hands pulling him upwards. At first, he'd thought he'd been pulled up and taken to heaven, as he opened his eyes and looked at his old comrade Jensen, the man he'd left in South Africa. How is this possible? Harper could see a tank rolling up behind Jensen, realizing then it couldn't be heaven. Only man-created killing machines. The tank fired, and Harper heard the roaring thunder again. It brought back all his senses. "Harper, we heard your message. We've come to help," shouted Jensen over the destruction. Harper turned and looked towards the EE. Everything had been reversed. Now the EE ran for their lives, and many lay dead on the floor. Survivors ran towards Big Ben and Westminster Palace. Jensen pulled Harper back, throwing behind the green tank. Harper saw the face of his old regiment, all crouching with rifles, using the tank as a shield as they crept forward. They were dressed in their green camouflage military uniforms. Real soldiers, thought Harper. 20 of them were behind the tank. Beyond them was the rest of the regiment, waiting at the other end of the bridge. Harper watched the odd soldier stand up and fire off 2 or 3 shots, then duck back behind to the safety of the tank. Harper then felt a second man grab his arm. His hand easily wrapped around his bicep. It was Chirac, unfazed by the terror that had just happened, his eyes fixated on the tank as he marched forward, looking like he'd been serving in the army all his life. He was a natural soldier. Harper gathered himself and understood what must be done. He shook death from his mind and reached deep into his soul, finding liberty. He walked with the regiment, side by side, with an old friend and a new one. Then Jensen punched Harper in the arm. "Let's do this." Harper could see a change in Jensen, a braver man than when he had left South Africa. The regiment and tank passed the dead bodies of the fallen comrades. The soldiers felt horrified, but the carnage didn't deter. It strengthened their hunger for redemption. "Don't let them die in vain," shouted Harper. Bullets rained upon them, and the sound of clashing metal hitting a tank was deafening. The soldiers stayed low, listening to the huge blast of the tank. A missile seemed to shake the earth. Then there was silence. The soldiers looked around for direction, like it was time to attack, but no official voice came. They were close to the end of the bridge. Harper looked up and saw the clock tower. Then he felt a rifle pressed up against his arm. Chirac offered him a weapon, holding it with serious eyes. It was the moment he'd been waiting for his whole life. Harper took the rifle and put his finger on the trigger. It was time. He jumped up, signalling forward, giving the sign to attack. The soldiers ran around the tank, firing. Harper sprinted, but stayed low, half expecting a torrent of bullets. Instead, he saw a lifeless line of bodies of the EE. Harper felt nothing. Then, from beyond the bodies, came gunshots. They came from EE guards that had taken into hiding behind concrete ends of the bridge. Their heads popped up and fired frantically. Chirac ran forward fearlessly. Through a tirade of bullets that just missed him, He jumped over the corpses and pulled his trigger, picking off EE guards, sending them to hell. Chirac and the other soldiers fired constantly as the EE took cover behind anything they could find. Harper kept his finger pressed down on his trigger, sending a precision of bullets. Some EE guards remained outside Westminster, hiding behind cars, statues and bollards as the real regiment stormed forward, always firing and taking cover. Harper fired a perfect shot through the forehead of an EE guard rising up from behind the statue of Winston Churchill. The EE was now taking cover to the left, in grass garden in front of a wooden door entrance to Westminster. The soldiers waited for the tank to catch up. As the tank crossed the bridge, then the clock tower, its gun turned and aimed into the garden. What remained of the EE hid behind trees and a small wall. The tank lowered its gun and gave off an uneasy silence. It didn't fire straight away, giving them a chance to surrender. The silence became too much for the enemy to bear. Hands of EE guards went up from behind, knowing it was hopeless. Dejected faces stepped out and walked single file across the grass, becoming prisoners of war. The army took their weapons and sent them back across the bridge. Then their attention turned to the triangular wooden door at the entrance. It was a double door, roughly 20 feet high. Harper watched Jensen talking to a radio. "We're in position," said Jensen, with the confidence that made Harper proud. The rest of the regiment made their way across the bridge hurriedly. About 100 soldiers coming to liberate a nation. Harper looked at the garden. Usually, it looks beautiful, a place of tranquility in the heart of a chaotic city. But today, bodies littered it. "How do we get in?" said Chirac. Jensen looked back at Harper. "Should we shoot?" asked Jensen, looking at the wooden door, the Norman porch. "We should," said Harper, raising his rifle. "Ready the tank," said Jensen into his radio. "No, with our rifles," shouted Harper. Jensen cancelled the order, and about 20 soldiers with rifles lined up perfectly in front of the door, all with faces of steel. Harper did what came naturally to him, and took charge. "Ready!" shouted Harper. "Fire!" An eruption of gunfire began to tear down the door. Within seconds, it was almost destroyed, splintered with holes as it began to crumble. The bullets stopped, and Harper, Chirac and Jensen stepped in the door, of what was left of it. Harper thought back to when Jensen had called him the Angel of Death, remembering how it had made him sneer inside. But knowing the EE would be waiting inside, he embraced that old name. He looked left and right and gave Chirac and Jensen the nod. Harper looked behind and saw soldiers ready to storm Westminster. He looked at the old door, about to collapse, then he raised his foot and smashed his boot through the centre. He then entered with his rifle at the ready. He stood on the marble floor, and in front of him was a staircase with red carpet. He then looked up, and from the balcony, EE guards pointed their guns downwards. "Fire!" came a call simultaneously. Gunshots lit up the chamber like deathly fireworks. Soldiers poured in like ants, turning left and right. Harper fired wildly, taking cover where he could, then firing again. In his peripheral, he could see comrades fall, but he fired with inhuman accuracy, taking out as many EE guards at the top of the staircase. The EE began to flee down corridors, intimidated by the numbers of soldiers storming into the lobby. Harper looked back and saw many fallen men, but felt a slight relief when he saw Jensen and Chirac at the bottom of the stairs, serenity in chaos. The regiment took a second to pay their respects to the dead. "We keep going, we keep fighting, for our fallen, for our country. Let's go," said Harper as the regiment scattered out through the building. Harper, Jensen and Chirac turned right, stepping over dead bodies. They entered a beautiful room, the Royal Gallery. Chandeliers with wonderful paintings decorated gold and red walls. As they stepped in, Harper could hear a body still breathing. A small trickle of blood was running down his cheek. He recognised him. It was Walker, the young lad he'd met in basic training. Their eyes met, but there was no time for sympathy. Harper stepped over him. He had made his decision. "Harper," said Walker, with his voice weak. Harper turned and looked at Chirac and Jensen. He felt like their eyes was judging him. As Harper looked down, he was filled with hate, a disdain for the evilness of what it stood for. It was the black uniform he hated most, the idea, not the young impressionable lad inside it. He looked back up at Jensen and Chirac, then continued through the room, leaving Walker to die. Soon they discovered a corridor. It was narrow and very long. The carpet was a royal red, and on top, beautiful shining dark oak. The wall on their right was wooden with Victorian paintings decorating it. The trio led by Harper slowly moved down it, crouching with their hands firmly on their guns. Gunshots could be heard in the distance. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew what they were looking for. Harper's priority was Bella. To see her big blue eyes again, it is what drove him. At the end of the corridor, near the centre of the building, they hadn't seen anybody. Gunshots were less frequent, and Harper had wondered if someone had found the Prime Minister. They passed several doors that blended into the wall. They paused and looked at each other with raised eyebrows, as if to say, "What now?" They hadn't noticed the door behind them opening ever so slightly. They hadn't noticed the pistol poking out either. It flew open, and Bestower pulled the trigger, shooting Jensen in the back of the head. His body dropped to the floor, and Bestower grabbed Chirac from behind, putting his forearm around his neck. The pressure would have broken any normal man's neck, but not Chirac. Then Bestower pressed the pistol against Chirac's temple. "Don't move," said Bestower in his powerful voice to Harper, who pointed his rifle at Bestower's head. The men stared at each other, all three in silence, as adrenaline coursed through their veins. Words had no purpose. Quickly, Chirac took his chance. He reached over his shoulder and snatched the pistol, knocking it off aim as he fired. The bullet collided with the ceiling, and Chirac hung tightly to the gun. He managed to turn under Bestower's arm. Then they were face to face, and both clung onto the gun. They glared into each other's eyes. Harper raised his gun. "No hurry. I want to take care of this guy myself." "You go," said Chirac. Harper sensed seriousness. I need to prove who was the bigger man. Harper didn't want to take away Chirac's honour, knowing he wanted to kill the man who might have killed his family. As Harper continued down the corridor, he listened to the struggle between the Colossus men. The shouts and cries became distant as he looked for Bella. Harper had roamed around for some time, passing a few soldiers who said they were still looking. He wandered from room to room, feeling like he may have gone in a circle. He then came to a wooden door, slightly ajar. He peered into a magnificent room, the Queen's robing room, and there she was. The room was huge. A Victorian painting of perhaps an old king on a white horse occupied most of the wall on his left. The carpet was royal blue, and to the right, a huge window looked over the city, letting in the light. Above him was a golden ceiling with the most elaborate patterns and colours. In front of him, sitting on a throne, was the Prime Minister in a black suit and tie with his hair slicked back. Sitting on his knee was Bella. She wore a little black dress. She looked stressed, looking away from the Prime Minister. Harper pushed open the door, forgetting to check for EE guards. He was mesmerised by Bella. "Beautiful, isn't she?" said the Prime Minister, holding her. Harper breathed deeply as he walked across the room, reaching his hands out towards her. "Give her to me," said Harper. His voice was weak, close to breaking. The Prime Minister looked up. His eyes were vivid as Bella's, but without the innocence. "I mean her mind, of course," said the Prime Minister. "A child's mind is magnificent, free of prejudice, of anger, or emotional pain. She just wants to be loved. It doesn't matter who loves her. I wish we were all like that," said the Prime Minister, rocking her gently on his knees. "You're sick. It's too late to see the light now. Thousands are dead because of you," said Harper. "After spending some time with Bella, I have seen what's wrong. I want to see how she sees," said the Prime Minister, with eyes that looked through Harper. His stare was full of insanity. His facial expression didn't change. It didn't feel real. Then he began to cry. "How do I be beautiful like little Bella?" he said as tears ran down his face. He looked pathetic, a shadow of a man. Not what Harper had expected. He stepped closer. "You can start by giving her to me," said Harper. The Prime Minister's arms wrapped tightly around Bella. Her face showed pain, but she didn't cry. Maybe she'd forgotten how to cry, thought Harper. "You're hurting her," said Harper. The Prime Minister stared with disdain as he rocked her back and forth, adding to the appearance of his insanity. Then slowly his grip loosened, and he let her go, but his stare fixated on Harper. Bella jumped down and ran into Harper's arms. He picked it up, holding her tightly, and continued to stare at the Prime Minister. "I missed you, Harry," whispered Bella. "I missed you too," said Harper, kissing her on the cheek. But he knew he couldn't rejoice just yet. He put her back down gently. "I'm so sorry," said the Prime Minister, running his hands through his hair. Harper had nothing to say. He had what mattered. He turned around and began to walk towards the door he came in through, wanting to leave the misery. Hand in hand with Bella, they approached the door. He could almost taste freedom. "Is that it?" said the Prime Minister, looking up with bewilderment. Harper didn't bother to turn around, his eyes fixated on the door, just wanting to leave the nightmare, wanting to take Bella far away from all the hate and murder and injustice. "Yeah, that's it," said Harper, closing his eyes. He heard the Prime Minister fall off his chair and began to cry. Harper didn't care. He knew others would take care of him. But then he felt movement, something around his waist. He looked down, then behind himself. He looked at Bella, holding his pistol, pointing it at the Prime Minister. "No!" But she pulled the trigger. The force knocked her off her feet as the bullet struck the Prime Minister's neck. Harper listened to the Prime Minister scream as Bella began to cry. Harper sank to his knees and covered her ears so she didn't have to listen to him die. Harper watched the blood and his pupils dilate. He held his neck tight as thick blood dripped between his fingers. Harper watched him die in the same way Lacole did. But Lacole died a hero. The Prime Minister died a coward. Harper held Bella close. He knew from that day she would never be a child again. The future was brighter for most now. A tyrant was dead. But what for Bella? Forever she would carry this darkness with her. A little girl who had seen and felt so much murder. 51. Tainted. Harper left Westminster, feeling empty but a little better about life. There was now a future. He walked back across Westminster Bridge as if he was walking into a new city, a place of new life for him and the rest of the country. Black smoke rose up from behind Westminster as he passed the fallen bodies of young men. He saw heroes and felt sorry that they would not see the future they had created. Walking towards him was a familiar face with a coy smile. It was Officer Andrews. He wore a green officer's uniform with a red beret on his head. It was a refreshing sight to see, a military leader in traditional fashion. "Good show, Harper," said Andrews with a bright smile through pearly white teeth. His tone made Harper cringe. Some people will never change, thought Harper. He took a second to look at the dead, looking at how young they all were. They were just boys. "I don't think so," said Harper, staring into Andrews' eyes. Harper walked by him and picked up the body of a young lad. Harper smiled, showing an unspoken mutual respect. He held the shell of a dead dream and carried the boy's body past the officer. Andrews, who felt shame, remembered the ridiculousness of war. For the rest of that day, they buried the dead. A series of talks with Officer Andrews and other officers from senior positions of the army were held. Harper spent the evening with them in a small room in Westminster, talking about the country's future. The main and obvious decision was to call back the military to the homeland to help mend a nation. The discussion went long into the night, but Harper's mind never wandered too far from Bella. He thought about how fragile and lonely she would be as he tipped back his brandy and signalled he was done. A rough plan had been outlined for the coming weeks, and Harper went in search of his dearest. After asking a few soldiers, he was directed to a bench across the road from Westminster. Harper walked through the lobby and through an entrance where a wooden door had once been, feeling the fresh air in his lungs. He could see Bella sat across on the garden bench beside Cowell. It was night now, and Bella's little legs dangled from where she sat. Harper jogged across the garden and forced a fake smile in an attempt to look brave for the little girl. "Hey guys," said Harper, with eyes fixated on Bella. She didn't say anything. She looked down and didn't seem herself. Her face could hardly be seen as her blonde hair covered her face like a veil. The only noise was the wind, and Harper looked at Cowell, who shrugged his shoulders. Harper nodded, which said, "I'll look after her now." Cowell got up and patted Harper on the shoulder. Then Harper grabbed Cowell and hugged him. Cowell said nothing. The hug said everything. Harper sat next to Bella and put his arms around her. She felt cold, and he pulled her in tightly. Bella, you're the most wonderful little girl in the world. I need you to know something, said Harper, holding her tightly. I will never, never leave you. I promise. Bella just sat motionlessly. She didn't cry, speak, or move. Harper didn't expect her to, but he would be there for when she did. 52. Rest. The nation had begun to flourish. It's inspiring to see how quickly hope and joy can spread. People began to re-enter their capital, and a state of celebration coursed through the city and country alike. With the EE gone and the Prime Minister dead, our country began to rebuild itself. Harry Harper sat nervously in the back of a limousine. He wore a beautiful tailored-fit suit. He looked out the window and saw a long crowd of people lining the road, looking jubilant. But he questioned himself deeply. Am I doing the right thing? He stepped out the car, listening to the cheer, and watched the blue, red and white of confetti fly in the air. He was at Buckingham Palace. The king awaited him. On both sides of the road, families cheered. They had come to see their hero knighted. Harper plastered on a fake smile and began to wave as he walked towards the open gates of the palace. He looked at the crowd on either side with a smile and with a wave that felt forced. He walked past the cheers and wondered if he was doing the right thing. He stepped through the pearly gates onto the red carpet and looked at grenadier guards on horseback lining his path. He felt shame. He was in the wrong place. Trumpets began to play, and his stomach turned. The king was standing there, waiting to greet the country's saviour. It should have been the proudest day of his life, but he felt sickened. Harper looked at the jewels in the gold crown and saw an artificial glory. Harper walked towards the king, who smiled, but Harper didn't. He held out his hand for the king to shake, but he did not take the nation's saviour's offer, looking offended. Harper smiled and didn't give him a second chance. Sorry, said Harper, but there's somewhere I have to be. Harper ran through the streets of London as fast as he could. He knew where he was going. He ran up a long road that leads to the magnificent cathedral that reached to the heavens as tens of thousands of people gathered outside. Harper looked up at white doves in the sky as the sun hit the cathedral brick, making it look like white against a clear blue sky. Harper peered over the crowd and saw what he was looking for. A black coffin was being carried on the shoulders of 6 men who walked up the steps of the cathedral. Harper ran into the crowd and pushed his way through, trying to make it to the entrance of the cathedral. People turned and greeted him with smiles and cheers, helping him through, patting him on the back. He then leapt over a metal fence and ran towards the coffin. His black shoes hit the tarmac hard, and the crowd cheered as Harper passed. Cowell and Chirac, who were pallbearers, held the coffin and turned their heads and saw what they had wished for. Glad you could make it, said Chirac gently. Harper smiled and put his hands under the coffin, trying to look serious and together as they prepared to enter the cathedral. As they entered, solemn organ music played. Inside, people rose to their feet. The coffin began to move, and Harper walked forward with it. He held his head high, trying to be proud, trying to show bravery. They walked down the grey stone aisle. On either side were white lilies lining their path, giving the cathedral an aura of beauty. They slowly walked the coffin down the aisle. They went up more steps, and as Lacole had done so many times before, she took centre stage. The coffin was placed down gently, and something dawned on Harper as he looked at the other men that surrounded the coffin. Lacole wasn't just special to him. She was special to everybody. He understood she was really gone, and then he noticed Bella. She stood behind the coffin in a black dress, like a little angel holding a bow of white roses. Harper walked to her and held her hand. People lined the aisle, waiting to say their final goodbyes. The line went out the cathedral. Harper looked down at the line and noticed how tears were slowly turning to smiles. Solemnness had disappeared, and it was replaced by a happy ambience. Harper then looked down at Bella. She'd killed the Prime Minister. He wondered what was happening behind her beautiful blue eyes. He wondered if she could ever have a normal life. In the last few days, it seemed that Bella had become more closed off, silent to the world. He began to notice people standing at Lacole's coffin and looking at Bella, realising she looked similar to Lacole. She had the same soft skin and the same wonderful eyes. The strength of beauty that really caught people's attention. People were drawn to it. Harper wondered if Bella would be up to the challenge of her destiny. "53. Promises. The poppy fields' smell rode on the air into the garden. The grass was long, and ivy crawled up a fence and a nearby tree. Iram stood on circular stone slab, leading to a treehouse, feeling the gentle wind blow in his thick fringe. The last time he stood here, he had listened to the laughter in the house behind him, as classical music from the radio had played a wonderful symphony, with the sun setting and his eyes closed in bliss. But now it was cold. The only noise was the rustle of leaves. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the laughter again and the smell of lasagna, but it didn't work. He just felt colder, more alone, and the sound of crying seeped into his imagination. He opened his eyes and looked at the grey clouds above, but the sound of crying remained, a gentle cry that could be heard in between the gust of wind. Someone was there. He waited for the wind to subside and heard a murmur coming from the treehouse. He walked up the concrete stones, then put his hands on the wooden ladders and climbed the tree. He hoisted his legs in, climbing the old oak. His pace quickened, and the crying became clearer. His head appeared through the bottom, and he saw her there, in a blue dress, looking at old photos. She turned her head slowly and saw Iram. Her blue eyes seemed grey now, her lips were dry, and her nose was wet from crying. "Iram?" whispered Florence, as she dropped the photos. Her tears stopped, and Iram's began. He tried to say her name, but he couldn't. He jumped into the treehouse and held her tightly, feeling life once again. Time stayed still as their hearts raced. It wasn't long before they were looking at the stars from the treehouse window, making promises and sealing them with kisses, knowing they would fulfill every word and spend the rest of their lives together. "54. Home. Over a city of new life, Harper looked down upon where one had ended. He looked at the white marble headstone and read the words out loud in the brisk air. Lacole, liberty of the people. It meant so much more than the letters cast in stone. Harper smiled at the roses in his hands. It was the flower of the nation, beside the woman of a nation. Both beautiful, both a symbol of love for their country. He lowered himself and placed the rose gently on the green grass below. He then touched the smooth lettering on the headstone and smiled. "I love you," he said gently. He stood up and looked down, hoping she'd found peace. He looked at the city as its lights turned on and the sun began to set. Putting his hands in his pockets, he turned and took pleasure, knowing it wouldn't be long before he returned here again. Maybe tomorrow. Then he took out his wallet and looked at a picture of a little girl he loved like a daughter. He then headed to a place he called home. Totalitarian. Written and narrated by Kieran Marsden.